it's not my job to stand up for the Democratic position or the Republican position on the government
We can
shutdown.
agree the sky is blue.
Yeah,
But the
yeah,
truth is
but
different.
the truth
Yeah.
is different, and
Yeah.
but that's why it's important that we stand up when it's like, look, what Brendan Carr did at the FCC, he very clearly
Yeah.
told local affiliates to stop carrying Jimmy Kimmel's show, and they followed suit because they need his approval for these lucrative ventures that they want to get. Like that is stuff that we're supposed to be calling out and explaining as much as possible. And the
Mhm.
more that we're seen as not actually standing up for a party or an ideology and more just seen as we're just here to call balls and strikes, sometimes that means you're going to be pissed off at us, the better.
Welcome once again to the Oath and the Office podcast. I am John Fugelsang, your humble manager, here to bring on the star of the show, the great constitutional law professor from Brown University, author of The Oath and the Office, as well as The Presidents and the People. You've read him in Time. You've marveled at his words in the New York Times. People of Earth, make some noise for Professor Corey Brettschneider. Hello, Professor.
Hi, John. What a pleasure to be with you. We have an amazing show today. We'll be joined in the second half by our guest, Jake Tapper, of course, of CNN, anchor on CNN, host of The Lead with Jake Tapper. And it's going to be, especially for this podcast, of course, we're focused on the question of a president's obligation to the oath, to the law, to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. And so we're going to talk to him about an amazing case during the Obama administration when there was a real debate about whether or not terrorists could be tried at all in the United States, and talk in particular about how the legacy of that decision to try alleged terrorists and then convicted terrorists plays into the current, lawlessness that we're seeing now. And of course, we'll talk about posse comitatus and the restrictions on the use of the military, the horrible
All
ICE
sexy
raids.
stuff. Sexy stuff, Professor. I'm here for it. Definitely.
But I know you wanted to talk about a story that's been engaging us both, a horrific story. And
well, before I get to that, because I know that unscripted banter is very important for shows like this.
We read that in the podcast manual.
Yeah, well, I mean, Corey and I are getting a lot of podcast coaching, so this is the unscripted banter part of the podcast, and I just want to congratulate you, Professor, on the insane ranking for this humble show on the Apple Podcast under government. I mean, well done, Corey. Well done.
Well, thanks, John, and I'll throw it back to you. It's really this dynamic that I think people are turning into every week to talk about the reality and the horror of the attempted coup by Trump, but also the hope in fighting back, and that's really inspiring people. It's true that we're number 5. Our last episode was number 5 on the Apple Podcast list with Malcolm Nance, the amazing Malcolm Nance, a discussion about information that you don't want to miss. And then on our YouTube channel, it's just blown up. It's in over 24,000 in 48 hours, people watching it. And then I can see
Professor,
the amount they're watching it in length.
I hope when you go to the Ivy League professor clubs, you lord this over everybody. I hope like when you're walking around the gym, like you're just strutting because I'm getting such great feedback and everyone loves what you do. And those commercials you made me do were really a hit too. Those are awesome. I'm really glad.
People should check them out. They're on the YouTube. They are amazing. They involved a brilliant line about Stephen Miller's coffin, which of course he sleeps in.
Oh yes, of course.
You know, my wife said when she was a kid, she thought she developed a loophole for bragging, which is that if you said not to brag, then you could brag. But this isn't bragging because it's really not about, it is about the discussion, the importance of the issues, and it's also about this audience that really cares to chime in. And so that's really where I need to send the thanks and the praise, which is people who really are caring about saving this democracy, even at its arguably most vulnerable time.
Well, I got to say, if everybody liked the multiple constitutional challenges of the first Trump administration, I hope we're all really enjoying the multiple constitutional crises of the second. This week, of course, we saw federal agents raiding a South Shore apartment building in Chicago, ICE agents zip tying children, African-American citizens dragged from their apartments and put in one van, brown-skinned citizens who could possibly be immigrants dragged from their apartments and loaded into another. And we're recording today. We're recording this at a week when we've seen a lot of judicial challenges against this White House. But this week began with South Carolina Circuit Judge Diane Goodstein's home burning to the ground after an explosion. Now, it's being investigated as an arson attack, but 3 people were taken to the hospital. And as you've said many times, Professor, the judicial branch has been one of the few institutions to partially hold and partially hold very steady. We just saw Judge Immergut, a Trump appointee to the bench, just say that Trump's whole assessment of Portland as being war ravaged was made in poor faith. And even under a legal standard giving the president great deference, the judge actually said, a Trump appointee, there's no basis for ignoring facts on the ground. The judge ruled that this call up of National Guard to Portland was based on a lie. And we just saw a judge in Boston say that this administration illegally targeted international students and arresting them for their very legal pro-Palestinian speech. That judge, William Young, said that non-citizens unequivocally have the same rights to free speech as U.S. citizens, which you've said many times. And we just saw in Nevada, a court said that the attorney there was unlawfully in her role. Right after the court in Jersey had the similar ruling against Alina Habba last month, because this president is appointing unqualified loyalists as top prosecutors. And one of his flunkies in Virginia right away got an indictment of James Comey that's not going anywhere. They know it's not going anywhere. It's just to bankrupt the man. They're weaponizing the law to bankrupt his enemies. And finally, the Supreme Court said that Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook could keep her job for a little while, ruling against Trump. But last month, it was this judge, Corey, Diane Goodstein. She ruled against this administration. She blocked the state of South Carolina from giving millions of voter data files to the DOJ. And she's gotten death threats ever since. And last week, Harmeet Dillon of the Justice Department under Trump condemned her ruling in a tweet. Early Sunday, the week began with Stephen Miller, the Gerbil Goebbels, puts up a threatening post to all far-left Democrat judges, accusing them of shielding left-wing terrorism. And within hours, Professor, Judge Goodstein's home was on fire. She was walking the beach when the fire started. Her husband was in the house with the kids and I think some grandkids. The husband was rushed to the hospital. He jumped and broke his legs. They still don't know if it was accidental or arson, but it's mere hours, Corey. So this is the playing field we're in. I mean, we can still discuss over whether, it's close to fascism or meets a definition of fascism, but children are being zip-tied and judges' houses are being burned to the ground.
We have so much to say about this. I mean, I'll begin with just a thought, which is that I have talked about the fact that the president's usurpation of the judicial branch and of the Congress, and also the information war in which basically lies are being told as though they're truth, that what they amount to is a kind of self-coup, the president trying to destroy these other branches. And part of that self-coup, the weapon that's being used, is by talking about judges as enemies. And those who fight back against unlawful action, do their job, judges are supposed to enforce the law after all, of them being accused, and this is part of the information war we talked about last week, that they're being accused of engaged in what Stephen Miller sometimes calls a judicial coup. Mm-hmm. Now that language, it couldn't but demonize these judges who, and I can't just say it enough, are trying to do their job of enforcing the law, unlike the Supreme Court, which has a lot of discretion, for instance, to overturn statutes, to overturn precedents. The job of lower court judges is to enforce the law as it exists, and they are, in many of them, and heroically pushing back against this administration, enforcing precedent, enforcing statutes. And then when the language about them is that they're somehow engaged in a coup, it's creating an atmosphere in which we are attacking the very foundation of our legal system. Now, whether we see this violence, I hate to say it, but it is part of the usurpation of the rule of law that we're seeing in so many different ways through ICE's illegal raids, in my view. Right. We're going to talk about that, through the use of the military illegally violating the Posse Comitatus Act. And then the general rhetoric is part of the coup as well. Now, yes. On the one hand, I want to just be honest, because as maybe people we have a lot of new listeners to this podcast who have maybe heard me on Midas Touch or John C. New promoting your bestseller book selling book on The Daily Show. And,
what, me? My best-selling book? I'm good.
and they might be wondering, but you're using the language of coup. They're using the language of coup. Isn't it all the same? And I see that. It is an information war. It is an instance in which we're both, but I am going to defend these judges, that they aren't engaged in a judicial coup. Many of them, as you just said, including this judge, were appointed by Donald Trump himself. And so they are just taking seriously their oath to preserve, protect the law, the Constitution. and then to turn on those who are regarded as disloyal. You know, Americans, and I want to go back to the title of the podcast because we do have a lot of new listeners that are streaming in. You know, it was very common before the founding of America, the United States of America, and the U.S. Constitution as we now know it, after it was ratified during our founding, to take oaths to a person, to the leader, to the king. Now, what is the oath of the American Constitution?
Don't tell Pete Hegseth that's not how it's supposed to be, because the
Well,
generals,
that is what
the
they
generals
think.
in that room knew it. Pete Hegseth didn't.
But let me just say what's obvious to long-time listeners of this podcast. These judges take an oath to uphold the law, the Constitution. The president does too, as required. The only oath actually written out word for word in Article 2. And yet, you know, what this person wants is loyalty to him. So the reason he thinks it's a judicial coup is because it's against him. And that's why that, you know, once we reason it out, we can see that Stephen Miller and my arguments are not the same, even though we're using the same word. I mean, I think he's mimicking the argument that myself and many other law professors, political scientists, and lawyers are making, that this is a self-coup, an attempt by the president to destroy the other branches.
Oh, very much so, yeah. And a very sloppy, messy, poorly executed one, I might add. That's why it's going to be very important for people to take very detailed notes of where everybody stood on every one of these issues, because Corey, this thing ends with the last scene of Scarface. And let me get into it by asking you about Chicago on two levels. I want to get to the National Guard issue and Governor Pritzker, who is, this guy's running for president harder than people who are really running hard for president. But first, this ICE raid. The governor has ordered an investigation into this violent raid that had children zip-tied, screaming, crying parents, people injured, African-American citizens dragged from their beds and thrown in cuffs in a van. Obviously, I'm glad someone's trying to raise questions about this agency's legality, and we have to have a national dialogue about their accountability before this starts going German. Now, ICE says they're defending federal interests, and they allege the local police interfered with the federal operation. So let me begin by asking, what are the constitutional limits on an agency like ICE when it comes to carrying out operations that really might violate state laws or local authority?
I think the first thing to start with, which is common sense, and I haven't seen a lot of rationality or careful analysis in this debate in this sense, that look, ICE has the right to exist. Nobody's doubting that that's a legal entity, that they have authority in immigration proceedings. But here's what they can't do. They can't, and even though they can engage in some of what they are doing in deportation, for instance, they cannot violate the criminal law. You can't attack children and engage in child abuse. You can't, without any cause or justification, abuse or torture people. So,
well, you're not supposed to be able to violate due process either, Professor. But here we are. I mean, that we're used to it now.
That's right, and there are fundamental rights to due process, not just for citizens, but for persons. That doesn't mean that the rights of non-citizens are the same as the rights of citizens, but they certainly have rights of due process, which are rights of persons. They have rights of speech, I should say, non-citizens, which is guaranteed by the First Amendment. So as ICE comes in and disregards, really at the urging of this administration, engages in what looks more like thuggery than law enforcement, we've got to start to push back. Now, what are the tools to do so? There are limits. So there's something, for instance, called qualified immunity that we've talked about in the past that limits the ability of people who are wronged by ICE to bring a normal lawsuit against them. But that can be stripped away, and there is legislation in Congress to suggest that. That is part, I should say, of the recovery that we need. There is no common sense argument for why an official who abuses a citizen should not be subject to a lawsuit that they themselves are liable for. But another thing that I'm trying to introduce into the national conversation is if they commit a crime, for instance, and I'll take an easy case, there are examples of off-duty ICE officers committing crimes. They're arrested and prosecuted, full stop. But even though there is deference to federal agencies and to law enforcement of some kind, if they're engaged in abuse of children, for instance, of violence that is unjustified and unprovoked, of things that are worse than that, they certainly can be prosecuted.
Yeah,
And what I'm not
yeah.
seeing is local prosecutors looking at some of these abuses for evidence of crimes. And my view is, and maybe this is controversial, that if they find them, they should bring those suits. Now, there are all sorts of political reasons for not doing so. They don't want to be targeted by Trump. Of course, he'll call them opponents, enemies, as he did when he was prosecuted by a local DA in Manhattan.
That's crazy,
successfully, I should say. But that's the kind of thing we've got to start talking about. Is the criminal law being violated?
I mean,
and we've
Corey,
also got to talk about how to make it possible to sue these agents. I should say, too, qualified immunity is not absolute immunity. It doesn't prevent any of these lawsuits. So starting to bring them, despite the limits of qualified immunity, might also be a way to start to think about holding accountability. Long term, though, we've got to get rid of all the protections for law enforcement when they abuse power.
Okay, so there's about 700 things you just said there that I need to unpack, and you're much more polite as an Ivy League professor than I'm going to be when I discuss these godless, amoral, punk-ass coward thugs that are ICE. Because I get to say that, you don't, Professor. No one can take my tenure away. So I mean, obviously, are you saying that there's going to be prosecutors too intimidated by what's happened to Fani Willis, by what's happened to Tish James, by what happened to Jack Smith, that prosecutors are going to be too intimidated to make their careers off of prosecuting these lawless thugs, when we all know that this can't be sustained with only 1/3 of the population supporting it? I mean, these people operate like they're above the law, and they do believe they are. And this is how Hitler's secret police happened. Now, you've written about constitutional accountability for executive overreach, but there's got to be a lot of legal cases to be made that ICE agents could be criminally liable for these actions. I mean, if no one's above the law, including the president, then that same principle applies to ICE as a federal entity. There's no constitutional basis for any idea that these cowardly thugs have any criminal immunity, right?
Right, exactly. Sorry, I said no, but I should have said yes emphatically. that the idea of presidential immunity is distinct to the office. The idea is that as the head of the sole representative of the entire American people, that really, I mean, the arguments are absurd, but they really have to do with the president's importance, the president being too busy to be distracted by criminal prosecution. They are very, very weak arguments, and as we've talked about at length, I think they're ridiculous, that the president should, including a sitting president, be subject to prosecution. But even as absurd as the Trump versus the United States ruling is, and the idea of presidential immunity, exactly as you say, it does not extend to ICE agents, to criminal immunity to those working for the government. So, you know, the vice president also doesn't have immunity under
I know it. Oh, and I hope the vice president knows it come January
and
of
Pete
2027.
Hegseth doesn't have it.
I know. Oh, there's going to be hands-on Bibles, Corey. What do I keep telling you? That's January.
And Stephen Miller definitely doesn't have it. And so, you know, as we go down the chain, Christine, all of these people could be prosecuted. But I think these cases have to start with the on-the-ground abuses. And as crimes are taking place by ICE, local prosecutors should bring them, and then they should start to go up the chain and think, what ordered who ordered this?
And start by going after them for handcuffing Ross Baraka in Newark. Start right there. I agree with everything. But we know ICE are also, there's this crazy thing, Corey. They lie. And are not punished for lying. They claim they were attacked by the local authorities after the raid, and then footage showed that wasn't true. So what are the constitutional dangers of federal agencies, again, these are taxpayers, spreading deliberate lies? I'm not going to call it disinformation, but lies to justify unlawful detainment. I mean, if Congress will not act, what mechanisms exist, state or judicial, to hold ICE accountable? Is it just going to be local DAs?
There are lawsuits, there are local DAs. And then I think the realistic thing, because how do you build towards legislation that's going to undo so many of the needless protections that ICE now enjoys, for instance, qualified immunity? Those cameras that are out there, the citizens who are documenting all of this, the more we can have transparency of what's happening in these raids, the more that you can see the disregard of due process and even more basic human rights, the more we'll see the need for these pieces of legislation, and the more actually there will be pressure on local government to act if there are crimes. And if there's child abuse, for instance, that is not legal in the United States. And we've got to see these prosecutions, and then we've also got to see structural change, and eventually we have to see accountability of the people who are ordering this lawlessness. You know, the framers worried about a standing army because they said the existence of a standing army would be a danger internally. It would act as a kind of dangerous police force of the kind that we had seen from Britain, shutting down the rights of individuals, not respecting even privacy in the home, which was such a big deal. Think about the constitutional guarantee against forced quartering of soldiers. All of that was meant to protect a zone of freedom, liberty. I was going to say privacy, but it's more than that. It's freedom from abuse of, well, a federal police force, which we're now having, which we certainly didn't have, and now is starting to act in this frightening way, shutting down our rights. Yeah. And of course, it's the same theme that they worried about the actual standing army that we do have, the military being used domestically. That this is really one story, the abuse of ICE and the story of the military, part of the administration's attempt to shut down our civil liberties by expanding and growing an aggressive and violent, I should say. This is the hard coup, not the soft coup that I've often talked about just in terms of legality. This is actually the use of force by the government, by ICE, by the military. That's exactly what the framers worried about, and yet we're seeing it on a daily basis.
We just saw this Oregon judge limit Trump's ability to nationalize the National Guard, but now he is apparently going to try to deploy the California Guard himself up there. And we now know he's ordering 400 members of the Texas National Guard for deployments to Illinois, Oregon, and other locations. Governor Pritzker tweeted, "We must now start calling this what it is, Trump's invasion. It started with federal agents. It will soon include deploying federalized members of the Illinois National Guard against our wishes, and it will now involve sending in another state's military troops." Governor Pritzker continued, and here's where it gets interesting. "I call on Governor Abbott to immediately withdraw any support for this decision and refuse to coordinate. There is no reason a president should send military troops into a sovereign state without their knowledge, consent, or cooperation." Corey, I don't think Governor Abbott's going to come to his rescue, because I think history has proven these guys only believe in states' rights when they're trying to defend white supremacy and racism. Where to begin? Let's start with the 1878 Posse Comitatus Act, your favorite, designed to prevent military use in civilian law enforcement. I know it's got a very complicated racial and historical legacy.
You know, I do think that at different points when we're going through the daily news and we are seeing these deployments to Oregon, possibly to Illinois, possibly elsewhere, that we've got to sort of dive in not just to the law, but the history, and sort of take a step back and see what our tools are that we can use in fighting back. And yet I think we've got to be honest. I wish I could tell you a story that in the 19th century, the Posse Comitatus Act was passed to fight, evil abuse of power. But it's a weird history and an unfortunate one, and I think we've got to be honest about it. The Posse Comitatus Act, first of all, is a law passed by Congress during the Hayes administration. And what it says is that you can't use the military as a local police force, full stop. So that's the good news. There are a couple of exceptions to that. For instance, the Insurrection Act and the Trump administration, although I don't think it holds water, is claiming that they have another exception is the right to protect federal buildings, which is an excuse to arrest people who are, they claim, without reason, are threatening those federal buildings.
Exactly.
That strikes me as BS. So we've got to, but what is this thing? Why does it exist? You hear about Posse Comitatus all the time. And the story is that there was a proud use of the federal government and even the military to enforce federal rights. In the election, for instance, of 1868, thousands of Black Americans elected Ulysses Grant at the risk of death. They were being murdered by white terrorists throughout the country. And so Grant, once he was president, passed a series of laws called the Enforcement Acts that were used to have the federal government, partly the creation of the Department of Justice, but also at points in extreme circumstances, the military to protect Black Americans in particular in their political rights. So Posse Comitatus comes from a period in which the reaction, the white supremacist reaction to Grant was in full effect, that in 1876, when Hayes is elected, there is a kind of compromise, a horrible compromise, made by Republicans and Democrats, which is to abandon civil rights, to abandon Reconstruction. Right. And this law is part of it. It really is a restriction on the use of the military, originally intended to stop civil rights enforcement. But here's the good news. As horrible history as that is, we can use it to protect civil liberties today, as much as it was used at one point to shut them down.
Right on. I mean, that's the thing. If Trump's legal team uses this old statute selectively, ignoring it or invoking it, depending on whatever serves his power, I mean, that's pretty much, well, that's what they do with Christianity. I mean, I mean, we've seen presidents use the military domestically before, Eisenhower enforcing desegregation, right? But how do those examples clarify the intent of Posse Comitatus Act? I mean, the Oregon ruling has already limited Trump's federalization powers here.
Look, I think that in cases of actual defiance of federal court orders, for instance, which is what happened in Little Rock, in defiance of the most basic civil rights law, and that's what was happening in Little Rock as the Supreme Court and lower courts were enforcing the Equal Protection Clause again, that I think is a legitimate exception to Posse Comitatus, that the Insurrection Act, in my mind, does give the president that power. But here's what it doesn't give the president the power to do, and Trump hasn't even invoked it because I think he knows it goes too far, to make a pretend story up about the idea that, the idea that there's some threat, that there's some violence when there's not. I shout out to our listeners in Oregon. I've been hearing from some friends in Portland in particular who are going out and just showing videos of the ICE facility there. There is no violence. It really is a made-up thing.
Okay, we got to take a quick break. This is The Oath in the Office. Welcome back to The Oath in the Office. I'm John Fugelsang. Professor, I know we're getting all keyed up to have Jake Tapper join us very shortly, but the government shutdown is continuing, and it seems like it's working exactly as they wanted it to. Trump has publicly celebrated the shutdown as a way to drain the swamp, which many sane people see as part of a broader plan to totally gut the government, to dismantle the administrative state, and to make sure that when the government finally reopens, there won't be much government left to reopen. Can I start with this phrase, the deep state? This is one of those code words that guys who, spend way too much time online alone use. What does that refer to in reality versus how it's being weaponized rhetorically by Trump and his allies? And how would a deep state have survived if Donald Trump had already been president for 4 years once before? It just seems like willful brainwashing they go along with.
As much as I believe and talked in the last episode about why this shutdown might be the only lever that we can use against a president who threatens democracy, there is a real danger in it. And this isn't without risk. And one of the dangers is that Trump is going to use this moment, and in particular with his ally, long-term employee, Russell Vought, to destroy what he calls the deep state. What does that actually mean? It means those civil servants who are protected under the Pendleton Act or under independent agencies, under various protections that Congress has created to ensure that the law is enforced, that he's going to just get rid of them, that he'll use the moment to destroy the civil service that has taken literally decades, a century, actually, more than a century to build up. I have to say, because, this sounds so abstract, the deep state and civil service, there is a guy who I think is dangerous at the moment. His name is Russell Vought.
Yeah.
And what Russell Vought is devoted to is getting rid of government. And he is a kind of libertarian and adherent of the philosopher and economist Milton Friedman, who really believed that we should have almost no government, that things like providing for basic needs or healthcare or kids that need food, that all of that really should be left to private commerce, and that the free market would take care of everything. It's, in my view, not a sophisticated view.
Just like it does on its own. You're right. Yeah.
And this individual, Russell Vought, is sophisticated. He's got a real knowledge of the law. And although he sounds a lot like Musk, he's smarter. And he realizes that he might be able to use this moment to get rid of a lot of the civil service. And he's going to do a different thing, which is he's long believed that although the law prevents what's called impoundment, the president refusing to spend funds and allocate funds as Congress has intended, this dual idea of getting rid of the civil service, spending funds as the president wants, is all an attempt to really claim pure executive power. And the shutdown is a primary moment for somebody like Vought. In fact, Trump retweeted something referring to Vought as the kind of grim reaper with, this kind of right-wing laughter.
This juvenile AI commercial he showed.
AI commercial. And yet, that's what we're facing right now, that this could be the moment in which the Russell Voughts and the Donald Trumps destroy the government that's charged with protecting us.
Of course. I mean, I consider this entire period we live in to just be porn for Satan, but that's just me. I mean, here's the thing, Professor. This shutdown has halted many government agencies, right? But not ICE,
Right.
right? Not
I think
ICE.
that's,
The
you know,
government's priorities are that the enforcement arms of government have to remain untouched, but programs that actually serve the public have to be frozen and defunded. Corey, are there any constitutional limits to a president who is intentionally paralyzing our government to undermine civil service protections?
well, here's the problem, and I'm going to bring this up with Jake Tapper because one of the things I want to ask him about is the difference between the Supreme Court that we have now and the one that was operating during the Obama administration. And the answer, if we were in the Obama administration, is there are a lot of protections against it. Impoundment is banned by law. The creation and protection of much of the civil servants are protected from firing without cause, from political firing. But what Russell Vought has figured out is at the same time, and I think this is, by the way, why he's not a libertarian, as you say, that he wants a dangerous police force, a national police force, the least liberal or libertarian thing that you could imagine. He wants to get rid of the parts of government that he doesn't like and that he believes are filled with his opponents. And the question is the Supreme Court going to allow him, under the theory of the unitary executive, which our audience knows well, they very well might approve, I should say, all of Vought's plans, even though it's in contradiction to many of the precedents that we've had in this country for decades and decades.
I mean, so when you look at previous moments, Corey, of a famous executive overreach, right? I mean, Bush's post 9/11 powers, Nixon and the Saturday Night Massacre. How does this moment compare? I mean, it's very fair to say that we're in uncharted constitutional territory every day, right? I mean, this is not really a recurring American cycle, is it?
Well, I think that part of what I argue now out in paperback in The Presidents and the People is that there are cycles. There are cycles in which we have presidents that really try to destroy the rule of law, to attack civil liberties, and then we have moments of coming back. And so as much as we really are emphasizing how dangerous the shutdown is. I also want to talk about the fact that we have recovered from moments before where presidents have attacked the rule of law or have tried to use the rule of law for their own purposes, the shutdown of dissent during Adams. The desire to build a federal government in Wilson's time, so-called progressivism, that was not progressivism for white people. That also is a moment that we had to recover from. So the truth is that much of the development of the government and its functions that wound up serving, at least attempting to serve all, were originally intended to serve only white people. I think that's true certainly of Wilson's progressivism. So we've had these horrific moments that we've recovered from before. And yes, we're going to see, I think, the destruction of important parts of the government and the buildup of dangerous parts like ICE and the military. But, I am always hopeful that we'll push back. And one of the reasons why I'm looking forward to the discussion with Jake Tapper is that it looks to a moment where things looked really bleak. The Bush administration argued that there was a war-free zone in Guantanamo. Yet due process prevailed. And so it is a time of hope that we'll talk to him about, as much as I'm going to press him on the danger to democracy now.
Yeah, for some. I mean, a lot of folks got killed really fast by Bush too. But,
I would not, and that is one thing we won't discount.
No, Tapper's book is fascinating. I'm excited to talk about it with him because it really does. I mean, I want to ask him about how it does relate, this war on terror story, so much to how they are trying to dehumanize people they would like to kill without due process right now. So, Corey, let me close it out with this. If ICE can raid and lock up Americans with no accountability, and Trump can deploy troops wherever he wants against U.S. states without any oversight, and the government can shut down indefinitely so the government can dismantle the government, what does this mean for the future of checks and balances? I don't think they're going to be able to cancel an election next year. And I think everything they do is getting people more and more excited to vote. I don't need the Democrats to have a leader. I can wait till after next year for that. But what does the next 13 months of checks and balances look like to get us to a safe election day?
I gave an interview for Midas Touch, which I was happy to do. And I think we have a lot of listeners maybe who heard that, who are joining us now, because I talked about what you and I are doing on this podcast. And, I think if I had a message in the book, The Presidents and the People, and on this podcast, it's that there are no checks and balances unless we, the people, demand them.
Yeah.
And that's why we're doing this. Because in the midterms, in the next presidential election, we do have the ability to put people in this Congress who are going to hold this administration to account, who are going to make use, for instance, of the subpoena power, hearings, to create legislation that actually protects civil servants, that limits the qualified immunity of ICE. All of that is possible if we turn out, if we see this election as what it is, a referendum on democracy. So are there checks and balances in the sense of the Supreme Court? I'm going to argue, as we talk to Jay Tapper, that no, many of the checks that were there before are gone with this Supreme Court that is essentially acquiescing all of its power to this administration. But elections, the midterms, the presidential election, those are moments where we can reclaim it. We've reclaimed it in the past, and we'll reclaim it again.
Right on. Okay, we got to take a quick break. When we come back, Jake Tapper joins us. This is The Oath and the Office. Welcome back to The Oath and the Office. I'm John Fugelsang. Professor Brettschneider, we have a very special guest today. I think a lot of your fans will know Mr. Jake Tapper from his work on the TV, on the CNN. But this new book of his, it's quite fascinating. I didn't think it would be so relevant.
The book is called Race Against Terror, and it really is about the question that we're asking throughout this podcast. Is there still a rule of law? Can we have a rule of law in the face of security threats, even terrorism? And the answers that we gave during the Obama administration and previously, how do they apply now, if at all, as we deal with a president who is trying to destroy the rule of law and destroy democracy? So it's really my pleasure and honor to introduce to the Oath in the Office audience. Welcome to the Oath in the Office, Jake Tapper.
It's great to be here. I love oaths and I love offices. So this is
Well,
great for me.
as listeners are going to hear, I was particularly excited to hear about this book and to read it and to see the connections to the current assault on the rule of law. And I'm going to just jump right in. Of course, your book about Spin Ghoul deals with an instance of first alleged and then convicted terrorists who was dealt with through the legal system. And yet, at the time, there was a debate. This is during the Obama administration, during the endless war, the war on terror, about whether or not that was even possible. And so I think that's an important entry point for especially our listeners who are so concerned about the assault now on the rule of law, to think about a time in which there really was a debate about whether or not an alleged terrorists, even before conviction, could be dealt with through the legal system, or whether or not the rule of law was incapable of dealing with it. So can you just start by setting up the story and in terms of the context of that debate?
So the story starts on the deck of an Italian cruise ship in the Mediterranean Sea during the Arab Spring. So many refugees had been fleeing Tunisia and Libya that the Italian southern islands, which are closer to Africa than they are to Rome, have become just overpopulated. So the Italians are putting refugees on these ships and taking them to a mainland where they'll go to a refugee camp. On one of these ships one day, this gentleman walks over to an Italian Green Beret and asks for water. The Green Beret sees him and notices he has a bullet scar, asks him how he got it. And the guy says, I got it fighting Americans in Afghanistan. I'm in Al Qaeda. I don't belong with these refugees. I'm in Al Qaeda. And long story short, the Italians take him into custody, call the Americans. They say, we have got this guy. He says he's killed Americans. Do you want him? Because we can't hold him for long. He disrupted things on the ship. We can hold him for a little while, but like basically he's just a refugee to us. The Americans go over, listen to Spin Ghoul confess to his crimes, killing Americans in an ambush in Afghanistan, trying to blow up the U.S. Embassy in Nigeria. And this is where the rule of law stuff comes in, because it's the Obama era. So there's no Gitmo on the table. The Italians wouldn't have let it happen anyway. They're so mad at how the Americans are doing the global war on terror. The only option the Americans have is to let him go free, basically, which is not an option because the guy has said, I want to kill as many Americans as possible. This is my life's mission. Or bring him to the United States, which would require an incredibly comprehensive, difficult investigation and sleuthing and proving the case against this guy. And that's what the Americans do. And it is, as you note, incredibly controversial in 2011, 2012, 2013 to do this, not just among Republicans on Capitol Hill, but Democrats too. People are acting as if bringing any of these terrorists to the American mainland is like bringing Thanos to the American man.
Right.
Like that they're super villains. People are still very legitimately terrorized from
Mm.
9/11, and they don't want these guys, whether it's Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and Gitmo or Spin Ghoul. But this is what Obama wants. And actually, it's the only option these prosecutors and FBI agents have. It's either do it the way Obama wants to do it, which is the only way the Italians will let it happen too, or let this, guy who's already killed Americans and wants to kill more free. So it becomes this incredible investigation. The
Yeah.
sleuthing is what I found so fascinating about the case. But then
Yes.
it also becomes this demonstration of American ideals that we
Yeah.
can do this. And now Trump is following, knowingly or unknowingly, Trump is now following in these Obama footsteps
Correct.
because he is trying to prosecute in Virginia a guy who would be the second foreign terrorist tried in American criminal court for killing service members abroad, one of the Abbey Gate conspiracy murderers.
Well, I
And
think
at the same,
it's an interesting irony in the Jafar case that a president who has been disregarding the rule of law in so many other instances is at least allowing, and I think it's an interesting question whether he even knows about this, but allowing the prosecution of alleged terrorists to go forward through the court system. But I guess my big question, and I think that of many of the listeners, is, the debate didn't end. It would be a great end of the story if the point of the book was that an American ideals and the rule of law prevailed. And we now know that even the most dangerous terrorists that our legal system can handle it. It's not incapable. It doesn't collapse when we see those who have committed evil acts. But yet, even though there is this tradition now in the Department of Justice of allowing prosecution of alleged terrorists through courts of law, we're at the same time seeing so much an undermining of the rule of law. And that's really what I want to ask you about, in the denial of the idea that, for instance, there are free speech rights for non-citizens in the Khalil case, or in the Abrego Garcia case, the claim that enemy nations under the legacy of the Enemy Aliens Act from 1798, that there are no due process rights. So it is true that in this one area, there's a precedent that remains even during Trump. But what do you make of the fact, I mean, to my mind, it's a story of at the time, vindication of the rule of law, but now increasingly that debate is back, and that there is this idea that we're not capable of prosecuting, forget about terrorists. I mean, even non-citizens who are have connections to nations that Trump anyway considers enemies. So what do you make of the fact that the debate is back, and that despite this one example, that the Trump administration is so often going the way of trying to really undermine or disregard the legal system? Does that sound too harsh to you? Do you
No.
okay.
I think what's interesting, it's tough to reconcile the fact that that Jafar is being tried in a criminal court with what is the common prevailing thought about Trump's regard to these issues. I mean, because look, let's be frank. If Trump wanted to ship Jafar from Pakistan, where he was picked up, to Gitmo and just keep him there forever, I don't know that anyone would stop him other than the
correct.
courts. Congress wouldn't intervene. Maybe the courts would, but like at the same time, I'm kind of inclined to think that this is U.S. Supreme Court ultimately would be inclined to defer to a president's executive powers when it comes to the war on terror and such. But he
Yeah.
didn't do it. I had Sebastian Gorka come on the show to ask him about this because I thought it was so interesting. I honestly don't know uh, if this is a victory for rule of law and the idea that we should live our ideals, et cetera, or we have just kind of landed in this consensus view of the best way to deal with foreign terrorists. But because in the book, I mean, when in the first Trump term, when Jeff Sessions hears about Spin Ghoul, and at this point, Spin Ghoul's in the US, it's 2017, so he's about to be tried. He's not happy about it. And there's
Right.
another case of another foreign terrorist, and Jeff Sessions does not want to bring him to the United States for trial. He doesn't want to do that, but he doesn't stop the case. But now we have Pam Bondi, Attorney General Bondi. I don't know if she knows that this was controversial back in 2012, 13, 14, or not. Either way, I take it as a evolution in society that we're not freaking out that this guy is in a jail cell in Alexandria because
Right.
he's not going to escape, you know? I mean, knock on wood, but like, you know, this isn't like a threat to us. He'll be tried and I no doubt convicted. Now, on the other hand, um, I guess the short answer on that one is I don't know how much credit to give them, or
Right.
just maybe just the evolution of society that we're no longer scared out of our wits every time a terrorist sets foot on American soil in chains, you know, and we were 10, 15, 20 years ago. On the other hand, one of the heroes in my book is a guy named George Toscas, who
Hmm.
was on the national security desk of the Justice Department. He was the gauntlet. He was the tough inquisitor. He was the one that the assistant U.S. attorneys had to get through before the Spingool extradition would be approved, before the Spingool indictment would be submitted to a grand jury, et cetera. He was the toughest guy. Like it was like once you got Toscas, the attorney general and the president, that was just cake. Like that was not a problem. You get it through Toscas because he'd been there since
Mm.
'93. He'd experienced all sorts of disappointments with confessions being thrown out and the like. And he was a hard ass. And I should note, has never talked to me, has never communicated with me, did not help me on my book at all. Like I'm not pleased with his respect for journalism, but I do know enough about him to know he played this important role in our national security apparatus. And I'm a journalist, but I'm also an American, and I also don't want to see people go killed by terrorists. And I'm glad he was there, but he's not there anymore because he signed the warrant for the Mar-a-Lago search. So when the Justice Department, when Pam Bondi came in, Toscas was sidelined.
There you go.
And his last day at the Justice Department's coming any day. And this is a pattern. We saw this a few days ago with the guy prosecuting Jafar at the Eastern District of Virginia.
Hmm.
He has been fired because some MAGA persons alleged something about him in the Comey indictment, blah blah blah.
That's right.
That and he's gone. So I don't even remotely understand what's going on. And in terms of the oath to protect the American people, I don't know.
Yeah.
I'd like to jump in with a question, Professor, if I could.
Sure.
Jake, it's fascinating going through the book and seeing how current it all feels, and how there really was a sense among some in government at the time that somehow giving Gould a trial would legitimize him, that justice itself could be seen as a sign of weakness. And now that we're in this period of extrajudicial killings of foreign civilians on boats with no evidence of guilt, I couldn't believe how relevant this all began to feel. This book captures a very specific moral dilemma, whether the states should pursue justice through law or through vengeance, through indefinite detention. And it seems like the central tension was whether to try Spingool in the US courtroom or to treat him as this phrase that we got used to, an enemy combatant.
Right.
Because when you're not following the Geneva Convention, you don't have to say prisoner of war. And I wanted to ask, one could argue that once we accepted enemy combatant status for some people, do you think it became easier to apply that kind of extrajudicial thinking elsewhere? I mean, is that one of the legacies of the war on terror?
I think if you're talking about the labeling of Tren de Aragua as narco terrorists,
Mm.
my general view on that is anytime a president gets a shiny new executive toy, the next president takes it someplace it wasn't intended, which
Mm.
is why these toys are always problematic. And I remember asking, I think it was Dennis McDonough, but I think I remember asking him on air about how much Obama used drones. And I said
Yeah.
something along the lines of, well, okay, so you're confident that Obama will only use them well, but what about President Sarah Palin?
Right.
So, I mean, I think that what we're seeing with the extrajudicial use of killing alleged narco terrorists with no criminal conviction, no due process, et cetera, is a legacy of that. It's
Yeah.
Obama increases drone warfare by 100-fold over Bush. Nobody says boo. Obama does this in Yemen, then Trump does. I mean, it's just like every
But also, is
time.
it? But the use of language as well.
Yes, yeah.
By going to, yeah, by
Terrorist.
enemy
Well, he
combatant,
says
or
he
by
calls him a
saying
terrorist. Yeah,
Or
because he's saying
terrorist. Yeah.
right.
he's invoking the language against terrorists that has been used so loosely with our legislative branch just completely AWOL with a few exceptions like Tim Kaine and Tom Massey and people who have been pushing, or Rand Paul, people have been pushing like for we actually are the ones that can control war on to declare war, not presidents, and it's up to us. Why have we completely just like handed this over to the president? But beyond that, that's what I think. It's just we're all, every president since 2002 has just been using, or 2001 has just been using this authority however they
Yeah, yeah,
want. Like nobody, when they passed it in 2001, nobody's thinking, oh, this is going to be used to go after alleged
yeah,
narco terrorists
yeah.
in the Atlantic Ocean. But here we are, and
He
like,
was
that's how it happens.
yeah
That's
used to
one of the
justify torture.
that's well, right, but and
Yeah,
that's look, I mean, I think Obama closed the black sites, but he didn't close Gitmo.
yeah,
And at the end of the day, presidents, when they're given a power, they don't give it back.
I think
And
too,
yeah,
in the case of Obama, that as much as the rule of law was used in this case that you were focused on, there is, of course, and you alluded to this, a drone strike case in which a family member brings legal action saying that due process wasn't granted in the case of drone strikes, and Obama doesn't agree to litigate that in court. They resist. And so
yeah,
there are these moments, and drone strikes are a big one, where the military power, at least, is still an exception. The worry is that now those exceptions have just become the rule, and
right.
your example of the rule of law is really the exception. It's one, and I had a question
mhm,
about that. Just going back to the question about the attorneys in this administration. I mean, and you've already raised this issue, but as we see, one of the real threats to the rule of law, of course, is that civil servants, including members of the Department of Justice, are being fired who are just not loyal. So we're not seeing people who are there because of their skill. Now, these cases are hard to prosecute.
They're impossible.
And
They get
so
thrown out of court all the
all the
time.
time.
so in the case of Jafar, this ongoing case, as you see the Department of Justice stripped of really quality lawyers, and of course many of the best lawyers used to go into the Department of Justice. I'm not sure that's going to be true going forward. Is even this exception, this I'd call it a kind of vestige or remnant of the rule of law and a kind of victory of the rule of law over the raw power. Is it even going to be possible without lawyers and prosecutors who can bring these cases successfully? My worry is that if this case, for instance, goes south, that there might be a realization that the dominant move of denying due process
Right.
might become universal rather than not fully there. I think we're pretty close, by the way. It's so dominant. You look at the moves of ICE, the use of the military, and then the use of this Enemy Aliens Act. I mean, when you add it all up, there is a kind of general disregard of this administration for the rule of law. Now we have a vestige, a remnant of the Obama administration that is the rule of law. But if it's unsuccessful because of the denial of expertise, is there going to be anything at all left?
Well, I do want to give a shout out to the judicial branch because I mean there
Yeah,
are a lot of judges out there, not just Obama and Biden judges, but
that's
Bush
correct.
judges and Reagan judges and even Trump judges
That's right.
that are there saying, no, you can't do this, no, you can't do that, no,
Right.
you can't, So that is happening. There is that degree of resistance to abrogating these values and standards that we hold dear. I am worried to the degree that I don't share a lot of opinions as a newsman,
Yeah.
but to the point that I have said on TV, and I wrote an essay for The Atlantic, like I am these decisions are making us less safe without
Yes.
question. This expertise, and again, I don't these are not friends of mine. There's no
No.
cocktail parties. There's no like whatever conspiracy theorists people have about DC journalists. Like I don't know any of these people. I just know their reputations and I know their track record, and I know you want you, as Nicholson said, even though he's the bad guy, you want them on that wall. You need them on
Mhm.
that wall. You need these guys
Yeah.
making sure that these cases are airtight. George Toscas tried to prosecute during the first Bush administration, George W. Bush, these four, I think, Hutu murderers who killed two intel executives in like Rwanda in the 90s. And the confessions were thrown out by a judge because they had been interrogated by Rwandans from the rival Tutsi tribe, and
Right.
and I think it was a woman. The judge said no, you can't, and they're now free men in Australia. And that almost happened again in 2010 with the Galani trial. Galani was the first Gitmo detainee tried in American court. He was tried for his participation in the 1998 embassy bombings. And the name of the chief witness against him had come from Galani's time with the CIA. And the judge threw out not just what Galani said, but even the testimony of this one witness. And Galani was acquitted of 284 out of 285 charges. And he ended up going to prison for that one charge, which I gotta believe the jury knew what they were doing. But it was a terrifying sign for, I mean, that was one of the reasons that the Spin Ghoul case was also so difficult, because people were like, oh my God, you're going to bring him here and he's going to be acquitted and then he's going to be blowing up people at Starbucks in Manhattan.
Right, exactly.
And so all of this is just to say, these are not slam dunk cases, because a lot of times you're dealing with allies that use torture, or the CIA was involved, or this or that, and it's very complicated cases. These guys in my book did it by the book, and I didn't write this book as a love letter to a functioning government and a functioning judicial process, but it is that. I mean, it is systems, the FBI and the Army and the U.S. Attorney's Office, everybody working together, even when they disagree. It is about a functioning government. I don't know the political beliefs of any of these people, honestly. I tend to think prosecutors are probably Republican, but I have no idea.
I mean, if it was a slam dunk case, then Gitmo would have been empty in all those cases. But
That's right.
I got to ask, I'm dying to know what you learned about the military officials or government lawyers who actually really wanted to follow due process here, and how much resistance they actually faced from politicians.
Well, I think one of the issues in the early years of the Afghanistan and Iraq war is that there was no functioning system or for, okay, then no, I don't think anybody had thought in terms of and then we need to have a way to bring these people to justice.
Right.
Like, I don't think Spin Ghoul, captured in 2008 as opposed to 2011, would have been tried. I think he would have just been sent to Gitmo. And let me also say, I think he would have been freed by now. Because what would have happened is he would have been sent to Gitmo, he would have been there for several years, and then some jag would have argued, you have no evidence against this guy except his confession in Italy. Who cares? Let him go. And then he would have been let go. He would have been sent to Saudi Arabia or Oman or Niger or wherever. And he probably would have gone and killed a bunch of Americans. That's because that was what he wanted to do. So in a way, I mean, this is all theoretical. I can't prove any of this. But just watching how everything has unfolded since 2001, I believe, and I was, I just believe that the way Obama did it, when it came to trying him in criminal court, actually guaranteed he would be locked away for the rest of his life and would never harm another American. And I don't know, and trying to legitimately be as agnostic as possible and believe that Bush and Cheney and Rumsfeld, they all were just trying to protect the country, like giving them every benefit of every doubt. I don't think that their way would have worked, because I think Spin Ghoul would have been freed by now, because there wouldn't have been the evidence that the prosecutors acquired.
It'd have been
I've got to ask you, Jake, about a kind of big picture question that you alluded to, and that we're talking about the Supreme Court a lot on this podcast in depth, and the what's known as the shadow docket or emergency orders, disregarding of precedent. So that was a very different Supreme Court in the background, of course, during the war on terror. And although they had bad moments, they had good ones as well. For instance, they rejected the argument that Guantanamo Bay was a law-free zone that had no due process within it. If you remember those arguments that the Bush administration was making, it was similar to the use of the Enemy Aliens Act, for instance, and the attempt to really strip away legal processes altogether. Now, the court pushed back in important moments, in Boumediene and other cases. I mean, what about now if the administration were to, for instance, if this case were to go wrong, partly because of the failure of expertise, and the administration were to latch onto it and to start to say, no more, we're not going to have legal cases for terrorists, and you could imagine that combined with Trump's rhetoric and aggression. What do you see the Supreme Court doing in the judiciary? Now, lower courts, as you rightly said, and we've been talking about the heroic actions of many lower court judges, might initially push back. But my worry is that ultimately, if we revisit this question of terrorism in the law-free zone or something like it, some new version, that this court might say something very different. I mean, are you more optimistic about this court, given how different it is in makeup?
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know how I feel about it. I could see, I mean, I tend to think that uh, President Trump's legal team uh, is not, there are not a lot of Ted Olsons in
Yeah.
in that crew, right? Uh, so I tend to think that somebody would be able to make a superior argument of um, we can try these guys in criminal courts. More than 600 terrorists have been sentenced. I mean, when it comes to military commissions versus criminal courts are just much more efficient. The precedents are there. The courts know what they're doing. And I think two people have been tried in
Mhm.
military commissions, and one of them partly something was thrown out. There have been like 8 or 9 plea agreements, but it is sclerotic. It is a slow, painful, awful process. Uh, some of the bad guys in my book uh, are only now starting to be tried in their military commissions. The reason
Right.
that the attorneys had heard about Spingool is because of terrorists that had been picked up and were at Gitmo and were, interrogated and such, and had talked about Spingool and others. So I mean, that's why they'd heard of him.
Right.
But I don't know. I have no, like, I, I mean, I know how Alito and Thomas would vote, right? But,
Yeah.
and I know how the 3 Democratic appointed justices would vote. I don't know. Like, there is part of me that looks at the rulings of Gorsuch and Amy Coney Barrett and Roberts and thinks I don't know what they would do.
Yeah.
That they might, I mean, there's 20 plus years of experience that shows that trying these guys in criminal court actually is more efficient. And there are so many, I mean, the argument that can be made by the people fighting to keep him, I mean, this theoretical case where Jafar is about to be sent to Gitmo, um, the people fighting to keep him in a criminal court system would be able to say, like, your system doesn't work. You have not been able to, the military commissions have not been successful. And so many people have been let go from Gitmo because there isn't evidence, and then they're picked up on the battlefield like 2 years later. I mean, like,
Right. Right.
Spingool's locked up forever. Like, he's never going to hurt anyone. I don't
Mm.
know how an Amy Coney Barrett would feel about that, especially because I don't see the Ted Olsons making a compelling argument. I see them working with like Neil Katyal and
Right.
others to
Right.
stand up for what you would stand up for.
Mm.
Thank you so much for joining us, Jake. Before I let you go, I just want to applaud you for such a gripping story about what happens when fear can override fact. And this book is really about how conflating terms like terrorism and crime and war can have enormous policy consequences. And I just like to ask you, going forward, how should the press and the public think about the difference between those words, terrorism, crime, and war? It seems like a pretty hot discussion we should be having right now.
People are throwing
Mm.
around the word terrorist a lot. Um, People like Stephen Miller are using the word terrorist a lot, and uh, I mean, I would agree that the political violence we saw against Charlie Kirk or whatever, I mean, that's an act of terror that's rooted
Sure.
in ideological differences, and it's unacceptable violence. But I'd be careful of people throwing around the word terror, especially when they're
Uh-huh.
talking about people who are not actually trying to kill Americans. Like,
Yes.
that seems like a very,
Yeah.
don't listen closely when people throw, because the word has an actual meaning, and it's
Yes.
very vital for people who are trying to protect us that we not conflate somebody who is actually inspired by ISIS or Al Qaeda or whatever with somebody who is not violent and motivated by political differences.
I do have one last question that's on this point, and I'm glad that you raised it. I mean, as you're watching, and as a journalist, somebody who interviewed President Trump just recently, in addition.
Well, it was a
Yeah.
text. I sent him I sent him three.
Yeah.
Look, the guy won't
Thanks.
give me an interview since I asked him tough questions in 2016. So it's a beggars can't be choosers situation. But I send text to people all the time because
Yeah.
I can't post on social media without like everything becoming a news story. So like I send
think
a lot.
you got more coverage because of the way he conducted the
Well,
interview than the
I
interview
wish
might
he
have
had.
gotten.
I wish he had done it in person. I wish he'd done it on the phone. But like,
Yeah, me too.
the problem is he won't give me an interview. He won't give CNN an interview. And anyway, so I just.
But I mean, that's related to my question, which is
Yeah.
how are you, I guess, going forward, going to deal with a president who it's partly exaggeration, by not just the president, but also his administration generally, using words like terrorism where they don't apply. And then, of course, it's also willfully lying and misleading. So how do journalism is all about truth, but
Right.
in a kind of world in which the president has a willful disregard, I think is a polite way to put it, of the truth. How do you cover it? How do you deal with it? Is it worth interviewing him? Is it just constant fact checking that we need and still dialogue, or are we just past that?
I think it's worth interviewing him. I wish that he would
Yes.
subject himself to my questions in person and not, by text. But again, that wasn't like a planned thing. What happens if Hamas doesn't agree to step down? Like that was what I said, and he wrote back, so whatever.
I mean,
But I do that all the time with all sorts of friends and sources and politicians, and he just happened to write back. I think we just have to call balls and strikes. When things are not true, they're not true. I think that there is a temptation among journalists. It's never fun being out there on Journalist Island, not making any friends on the right or the left. And I think that I think we have to be sure that we're clear-eyed about just covering things. Like for instance, the government shutdown. Like we just call what the facts are and who's doing what. And we just have to just be neutral arbiters. Like government shutdowns happen, and this is what they want, and this is what they're saying, and here's the truth, and here's the facts, but I'm not taking a position on the shutdown. Just like trying to explain what both sides are coming from, trying to explain who's telling the truth, what the truth is, reaching out to people on the left and the right to find out, well, when you say this, what do you mean?
mhm.
And trying to be as neutral as possible when it comes to things that we don't have to stand up for. Like, it's not my job to stand up for the Democratic position or the Republican position on the government
We
shutdown.
can agree the sky is blue.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
the truth is
but
different.
the truth is different. And
Yeah.
but that's why it's important that we stand up when it's like, look, what Brendan Carr did at the FCC, he very clearly told local affiliates to stop carrying Jimmy Kimmel's show, and they followed suit because they need his approval for these lucrative ventures that they want to get. Like, that is stuff that we're supposed to be calling out and explaining as much as possible. And the more that we're seen as not actually standing up for a party or an ideology, and more just seen as we're just here to call balls and strikes, sometimes that means you're going to be pissed off at us, the better. I think that's
great.
that's how
And-
I do it anyway. I know, who knows how much time
And
I
of
have
course,
left.
there's a difference between truth and the idea of a sort of extreme neutrality, where you just, say
no.
both two guys are equal.
No, but that's, I mean, right, exactly. Like, facts are facts, and we don't have to pretend that they're not. But by the same token, we need to be neutral arbiters, because not all of the disputes are, between, like, Trump's not wrong about everything, and Democrats aren't right about everything, and just like that's just not the world we live in. And for journalists, I'm saying, for journalists to take a side because we want to feel like, well, we're with this team, or Trump is mean to journalists, therefore I have to oppose everything he does and says. That's not the job.
But you would agree the job, though, is to question authority.
Yes,
right?
all authority, 100%, 100%, all authority. Yes, look, I mean, those weren't super tough questions that I texted.
No, not at all.
But I mean, I just asked 3 questions about the process and 1 question about the government shutdown.
Yeah.
I'm not submitting this for an award. This was just
No,
like
but it's a
sitting on
great
my
anecdote.
couch, watching the Phillies lose, and like sending text to the president. That's, and he happened to write back. That's all it was. But
Instead of a bad interview, he gave you a great story.
I don't know that it was It's slightly less painful than the Phillies loss. But I will say, oh, you're LA people out there. Sorry.
New York right here.
New York.
Right,
Oh,
New
you're in
York.
New
Mets.
York. Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Oh, Mats, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry for your loss.
That's why I'm wearing all black, sir. It's why I'm wearing all
Okay,
black.
I appreciate it. I appreciate it. Anyway, yes, but we do need to speak truth to power, and but look, I mean, you'd have to go back and look at the interview I did with him in 2016, but this is how long ago it was. It was during the Trump University case, and the judge, Judge Curiel, was from Indiana, but he was Mexican American, and Trump was trying to argue he couldn't do his job because he was Mexican, and I was saying he's from Indiana, and if you're saying he can't do the job because of his race, isn't that the definition of racism? And it took me like 100 tries before I got to there, but I got to there, and it got some attention, and I never got to interview him again. So, I mean,
Yeah.
but I think that that's important.
Congratulations.
But that's important to like get to a point and call things out, and you know,
Yes.
Well,
I
Jake,
agree.
I can't imagine a better discussion for a show as ours is about the oath and the office and the pledge that a president takes to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution and the law. We, of course, talked about the question of whether or not there is a rule of law left, and the inspiring story of how the rule of law can prevail even against in cases of terrorism, and why it also is important to preserve that idea of the rule of law and to be careful about that use of the term terrorism. And also, of course, we appreciate the discussion of thinking about truth and the distinction from some kind of extreme form of political neutrality. Thanks so much.
Thank you so
Jake
much.
Tapper. Thanks
It's
for
great.
this.
And John, I
terrific
really
book,
liked
Race Against
your
Terror.
thing. John, you said something recently about Christianity, and I'm not of your faith, but I found it
I know.
very, very intriguing and very moving. So
I'd love to have Simon & Schuster send your office a copy of my book, if that'd be
Oh,
okay. I think you'd be very interested in it.
100%.
It's all about scripture and our politics
Oh,
and Christian nationalism, but from a very
yeah,
scriptural viewpoint.
absolutely, 100%. Love to have you on to
The,
talk about
the
it.
main character is a Jewish guy. He's pretty. He comes off
I,
pretty well in it.
I
So
think
It's a
I've heard
great
of him.
book.
Yes.
yes,
All right.
thank you, sir.
Thanks, guys.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
Jake.
Professor. It's always a pleasure to do this show with you, and I want to thank everybody for subscribing, for propelling this show to the top 5 on all government podcasts on Amazon. Corey, I'd call that a meteoric rise, except meteors fall and it's a stupid expression. But congratulations. I mean, I'm just so grateful. So I want to remind everyone out there, please, we take your mail, write to us. And Professor, what's the best way for our listeners to follow you and keep up with your brilliance the other 6 days of the week?
You can send me questions at corey.brettschneider@gmail.com. We're gathering them. We answer them every few episodes. And also, I want to just say, shout out to you, John, and to our discussion with Malcolm Nance. We have a lot of new listeners. If you haven't pushed that subscribe button, whether you're listening on one of our audio channels, wherever you get your podcasts, on Apple or one of Spotify or one of the others, or on YouTube watching us, push that subscribe button and keep joining us as we continue this fight for democracy. Thanks
I want
for
to thank Wendy
watching
and
The Oath in
Beowulf
the Office
too, and
or
everyone
listening
who
to it.
puts this together, all the people who slave over a hot oven to put this podcast together. Thank you, Wendy. I'm John Fugelsang. You can hear me 5 nights of the week on SiriusXM Progress or the John Fugelsang podcast, free every day. The book is called Separation of Church and Hate. And Professor, thank you so much. It's really, really a pleasure to come here and get to pretend I'm smarter than I really am, thanks to your constitutional brilliance. We'll see you next time on The Oath in the Office.